sensitive to what Advent means for those of us who have often felt and continue to feel that we can find no home, who were expelled from their homes, who hoped to find new homes, who found new homes but were told the doors were closed to them, who have been prevented from making the home of their choice according to their love, their passion, and their hopes. And so I'm mindful of feeling at home here during this season. And I'm excited to talk about Mary, a Protestant going to a Catholic institution for the past 3 years. I've heard a lot of Hail Mary, full of grace, so I'll try to do it justice. But I wonder whether or not Mary felt at home in her own body by the time in Luke that she recites her song, this Magnificat that we just read. I wonder if Mary in this beautiful recitation was not hoping for something quite other than what she was experiencing. I wonder about the complexity of her lived experience, the intersectionality of her life, the hopes and dreams she carried as a young Jewish woman living in Palestine under Roman oppression. We typically don't do this during Advent, however. Typically, we reflect on the Holy Mother of Christ, who at best is portrayed as being an agent of her own destiny, who chooses, who says yes to this providential path set before her. We marvel at her seemingly unprecedented wisdom and her willingness to be a servant to all humankind. Sometimes we pander to gendered notions of motherhood and submissiveness, making of Mary an ideological trope, an enfleshed instantiation of perfect piety and uncanny maternal instincts. We make her the antitype of Eve, who chose disobedience and brought death. Mary is obedient and brings life to all. But at worst, however, we erase Mary. We like to pretend, perhaps, that her role in this narrative is indispensable, but more often, our breathless anticipation on these silent nights for the birth of the Messiah all too often strangles Mary's voice from the story. She is relegated to being a surrogate, a warm body to bear God's body, an unblemished womb through which God might enter the world. She looks, head covered and bowed, cast in porcelain, plastic, or clay, over our nativities at God's Son, and all we can manage to ask of this new mother with a pandering sense of superiority is, "Mary, did you know?" What sort of question is that for a mother? But who is this woman, Mary of Nazareth? Only a short time before this, as we read, Mary is simply a young woman living in Galilee, engaged to be married to a man named Joseph. In the popular imagination of many, Mary is not only a young woman, some 12, 13, or 14 years old, but also, importantly, a virgin. This fascination with Mary's adolescent age and her sexuality is troubling in and of itself. A number of depictions of Mary and Joseph as parents-to-be traveling to Bethlehem, or as new parents, typically shown an expressly youthful, unperturbed, quite placid Mary, which staid depiction has become synonymous with her virginity, and an aging, wizened, and stoic Joseph. And even not some 2 years ago, when Roy Moore, the racist, disbarred, and disgraced Alabama Supreme Court judge, made his bid for the United States Senate, he was credibly accused of having preyed on girls when he himself was an adult man. The state auditor of Alabama at that time defended Moore's alleged sexual predation by referring to the great age difference between Joseph and Mary, implying that as the parents of the Lord Jesus, such unions are somehow retroactively also made licit. Needless to say, Moore needed an act of God to win that election, but God thankfully declined to intervene on his behalf. However, as with so many religious myths, there is less factual than metaphorical truth to such depictions. As Paula Fredrickson notes, we know almost nothing about Joseph, his life before he becomes engaged to Mary, much less how old he may have been. The same can be said for Mary, who, though undoubtedly younger than perhaps the median age for marriage in the United States in 2019, is likely to have been close in age to Joseph. The purported fantastic gap in their ages has instead served to justify the depiction of Mary as a perpetual virgin after giving birth to Jesus. The siblings of Jesus, as they are mentioned in the Gospels, are explained away as the adult children of a previous marriage of Joseph's, and such hermeneutical gymnastics are perhaps impressive with their creativity, but insulting and even damaging to rigorous interpretation. And they are insulting and they are damaging to Mary. Theologians and scholars of much greater repute than I, like Judith Butler, Marcella Althaus Reed, Rosemary Radford Ruther, Mary Daly, John Boswell, and Lynn Tonstad, and others, have spent their entire careers deconstructing norms of gender and sexuality, theorizing their construction, performance, intersection, and fluidity. And it would seem irresponsible for me to speculate on the time that I have on something others have said so well. But neither can I wholly shirk the duty of decrying a negligent hermeneutics of heteropatriarchal sexism, which paints Mary as a submissive and troublingly young girl who merely accepts the duty of gestating the Son of God by saying, "Be it unto me according to the Lord." This phrase, the fiat mihi, the "be it unto me," is often the focus of Marian devotion and scholarship and sermons during this time of Advent. It is taken as being indicative of Mary's exercise of a divinely endowed piety and wisdom, coupled with a supra-virtuous motherhood that only a virgin chosen to bear the Messiah might have. However, what I'm more interested in is not the dialogue, but in Luke's description of Mary's reaction to all of these things. 2 verses in the Annunciation, which we didn't read, stand out to me more than others. Gabriel greets Mary by saying, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. To say that Mary was much perplexed is a generous understatement. It's not that Mary, a woman living in Palestine in the first century, didn't have the benefit of our enlightened and postmodern perspective that may have dismissed such an angelic visitation as being a hallucination, nor is it that our access to literary and historical criticism jeopardizes this narrative as being incredible to the level of mythologization. To say that Mary was much perplexed means much more, because Mary is so much more than we so often think of her as being. The interpretations of Mary in this narrative, as I've just described, often paint her as being naive and a passive young woman who is apparently compensated by the fact that her maternal role is to be the bearer of God's Son, who, as the angel promises, will sit on the throne of David and whose kingdom will have no end. But I think Mary's response, "Be it unto me," which comes after a line of questioning she directs back to Gabriel, reads much more like a bewildered statement of resignation than maternal piety. In fact, I think it's hardly inappropriate to suggest that Mary is a reluctant mother here. Even if indeed Mary is a young woman, motherhood isn't a foregone conclusion for her. It's true in her time, becoming a mother may well have been normalized culturally, religiously, and socially, but it would be inappropriate to suggest that merely by dint of her being a woman that Mary somehow welcomed with a placid, semi-divine composure not only motherhood, but further, motherhood of God as the Theotokos, the God-bearer. Why should she accept what it is that Gabriel has to say to her? As a Jewish woman living in first century Palestine, Mary would undoubtedly have been familiar with the immense risks of pregnancy and childbirth. Speculation aside, it is likely statistically even that she knew personally, or perhaps knew secondhand, of women who had not survived either. This is to say nothing of the rate of miscarriage or the frequency of other forms of reproductive loss, which are no less perplexing and traumatic today as they were then. Theologian Margaret Kamatsuka comments that for Mary, quote, "In Jesus' day, the risk of death in childbirth was high. Christ's birth is a narrative of miracles, but also must be seen as an event of extreme vulnerability. Upon becoming pregnant, notwithstanding the angel's prophecies, Mary would have seen her future as uncertain and risky, socially and medically. Unless one wants to posit that God miraculously removed from Mary's consciousness beforehand any thoughts of unwanted pregnancy or any normal fear of birthing, then one has to conclude that the incarnation was an unintended pregnancy that became, with God's empowering grace and Mary's choice, a wanted and safe pregnancy." End quote. Further, Gabriel greets Mary as one of God's favored ones, and only then claims that the Lord is with her, which phrase is perhaps meant as a euphemism for what comes next, but which is nevertheless not stated explicitly in the entire Annunciation, namely, that Mary's pregnant now. How is Mary supposed to feel about all this? At some point, many suggest on her meeting with Elizabeth, she would acknowledge that she was pregnant. How utterly isolated and scared would Mary have felt, might any of us feel, to have something happening to our bodies against our will and out of our control? Here's Mary, a young Jewish woman, perhaps hopeful for what her new life with Joseph might bring, or perhaps quite doubtful that it includes anything good. And now she finds herself at the center of a series of events that not only has drawn her in as its protagonist, but has crudely made of her an enfleshed plot-bearing device. She is pregnant, and until we come to our reading tonight, she is left alone with her thoughts, doubtlessly considering how she can make any sense of this, whether anyone will believe her, whether she wants this child that has been made hers to carry, wondering how her life in the span of one day has completely slipped the bonds of credulity. How can she bear all of this? To say she is much perplexed is a generous understatement. She is suddenly not even at home in her own body. But what of Mary can we gather from what we read? How does she cope with what is happening to her? Who is this Mary of Nazareth? It is after Gabriel calls her one of God's favored ones that Luke notes that Mary was perplexed and wondered what sort of greeting this might be. What does that mean, Mary perhaps thought, to be God's favored one? Surely it's not a specific reference to Mary's ethnicity, to her being a Jewish woman who was therefore one of the elect nation of Israel. This is assumed in the text of the Annunciation because God promises that this child will be an heir to David's throne and the perpetual ruler of God's kingdom. Favor isn't socially or politically indicated here either. While its proximity to the larger city of Sepphoris tells us that Nazareth is not the backwater it's often painted as being, Mary is nonetheless of no great power or influence. She's engaged to be married to an artisan carpenter, which is hardly highly estimable. We don't know whether Mary's family had any clout to speak of, or whether this marriage, as so many in her time, was sought to secure for her the patriarchal protection and provision her society necessitated for the bare survival of women and children, or whether she was a willing actor in it. So what did it mean that Gabriel has called her one of God's favored ones? After Mary complies reluctantly, as I said, she stays in Nazareth for some time, but we then find her traveling to see her cousin Elizabeth, a story unique to Luke alone. God knows what Mary's feeling at this point, though I think it's safe to assume she knows that she's pregnant. Interpretations of her greeting to Elizabeth aside, it seems insulting to Mary, again, to assume that she would not be aware of what's happening in her own body. Experiencing the risk and uncertainty of an unwanted, inexplicable pregnancy, Mary seeks out Elizabeth, who Kamatsuka again suggests helps her to, quote, accept that bearing a child is a positive thing, end quote. Perhaps this is what happened. Perhaps seeing her cousin pregnant, having another woman, a family member no less, greet her with such joy and welcome, instills some sense of comfort with Mary, who still does not feel at home in her own body at this point. It is important not to erase Elizabeth here, as we so do often with Mary. Indeed, I don't think we can interpret what comes next without Elizabeth's intervention, without her prophetic words of encouragement and faithfulness in praise of Mary, God's favored one. But what does that mean? Who is Mary of Nazareth? She is a Jewish woman living in first century Palestine under the oppressive rule of Roman colonizers. She, like her ancestors, is an Israelite. Her story is their story. Her God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of Ruth, Rahab, and Tamar, of Deborah, David, and Solomon. That is to say, Mary was confronted with an unwanted, inexplicable pregnancy as a Jewish woman living as one of God's elect under the thumb of empire, subjugation, and control. Imagine living in all the uncertainty that the first century already contains as a matter of bare contingency, compounded by the daily reminder that as a Jew, her social, religious, and economic life was not her own, but was mediated by the presence of an occupying force who had no sympathy for her, for any of God's people, compounded by her place as a woman in a heteropatriarchal and sexist society that further subjugated her to the indecency of dehumanization and disempowerment, compounded finally by an unwanted and inexplicable pregnancy with which she, as so many mothers and parents, likely had little to no idea how to cope or even survive. Not only is her land not her home then, but neither is her body at this point either. Fleeing to her cousin Elizabeth's home seems to me like a concrete act which expresses a metaphorical and hopeless desperation. She can't escape her own body, and wherever Elizabeth lives, she likely doesn't escape the eye of the empire, but at least she can pick up her feet and put some distance between herself and what happened in Nazareth, even if in her own body she no longer feels at home. It would be insulting, after all, to assume that Mary was unaware or callously uncaring about her socio-political position, about the fractious state of existence in which she, her family, her community lived. Mary knew. So how could she be expected to have a child in the middle of this? Hoping for a child is one thing, a hope we do not know if Mary even had. But this is complicated by what was likely for Mary and for others all around her, a hoping against hope for freedom from oppression, for a liberation, a hope constantly deferred by wars fought and wars lost, a hope that likely seemed beyond the pale of reckoning. How can she ever feel at home in her own body again? How will she make a home for this child that she can't explain, in a place that is no longer a home to her or to her people? Because she is Mary of Nazareth. She is the one in whom this deferred hope comes to be. She is God's favored one who, by her power, sees and accepts, and in her song that we read, magnifying God, tells us, if we would hear her, how she has come to make meaning of what is happening to her, what is happening in her very flesh. What is it that Mary tells us? How does she come to make sense of her place in her world, in her land, and in her own body? Dorothy Zola imagines Mary's song this way, differently. Zola writes, "It is written that Mary said, 'He hath shown strength with his arm, he hath scattered the proud, he hath put down the mighty from their seats, and exalted them of low degree.' Today we express that differently. We shall dispossess our owners, and we shall laugh at those who claim to understand feminine nature. The rule of males over females will end. Objects will become subjects. They will achieve their own better sight. It is written that Mary said, 'He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he hath sent away empty. He hath hope in his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy.' Today we express that differently. Women will go to the moon and sit in parliaments. Their desire for self-determination will be fulfilled. The craving for power will go unheeded. Their fears will be unnecessary, and exploitation will come to an end." Mary is God's favored one because in Mary, the liberation of the world begins. Mary is not God's favored one because of her feminine submission or gendered acquiescence to motherhood. She's God's favored one because the God of Israel, the God of Mary's ancestors, is revealed in the faces, in the lives, in the bodies of the poor, the dehumanized, the despised, the beaten down, and the forgotten. In Mary, this young Jewish woman from Nazareth of Galilee, the hope of her people, the hope of the world, is no longer deferred beyond hope. It is coming. God is coming. And more, God is becoming through Mary. Mary is not the occasion of pietistic reverence for submission, motherhood, or sexual purity, whatever that means. Mary is the bearer of God and the bearer of our hope. She is the one whom God has regarded, verse 48 says, to whom God turns God's face, the God who does not despise but favors the lowliness of God's servant, who favors Mary and has chosen in her to become enfleshed, to become incarnate, to become the liberation for which Mary likely hoped with her people against hope. Mary is the bearer of our hope. Mary is the one who makes in herself, inexplicably, at great risk, a home for the body of God, that we might ourselves be at home in God's body. Everybody. Inexplicable, risky, unexpected, uncertain, non-binary, fluid, disabled, queer bodies. This Advent, let us learn from Mary that we need not fear to find no home again. Mary bears our hope and our home in her body, for she is the favored one of God. She is Mary of Nazareth. Hail Mary, full of grace.